Welcome to the Circular Economy Show, brought to you by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where we explore the ins and outs of the circular economy with the help of those working on the field to make this transition from a linear take-make waste economy to a circular economy a reality. My name is Laura Franco, and I will be your host for this episode. COP26, which is also known as the United Nations Climate Change Conference, is kicking off in a few days in Glasgow, Scotland. It will bring together parties, or also known as the governments, and non-parties, such as businesses, NGOs, youth groups, etc. They will bring them together to accelerate action towards meeting the goals that were agreed upon the Paris Agreement at COP21. Countries agreed to contain global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably to 1.5 degrees. There is a lot at stake, and in this episode, we will explore some of the expectations around this year's edition and also what key holders have to say as we look ahead to the schedule in Glasgow. But first, my colleague Jos Bleriot had a conversation a year ago with Nigel Topping, who is the UK's high-level climate action champion at COP26, about what some of his expectations for this conference were. Let's hear what he had to say.
And a final question, Nigel. As you look forward to COP26 just over a year from now, what outcome would satisfy you or would make you feel that the job has been done well?
Well, for me, my main focus is on getting to COP with a very clear sense that in the majority of sectors in the global economy, so across transport, materials, power, the built environment, and food and agriculture, we have achieved what you might think of as a breakthrough point when more than 20% of the main actors are committed to and on track to the zero carbon economy before 2050. I mean, it's an inexact science, but we know that roughly once you get 20% of the system on track, you're on the exponential part of the S curve, and everybody tends to follow. And that's, I think, one of the things we're really trying to do now is tell that story of exponential change, because we know that's the way that every single industrial disruption that's ever happened has gone through an S curve. So a lot of every time I hear a narrative which is linear, which is, oh, we're only at 4% EV penetration, for example, I get overexcited and jump up and down and say, yes, but we were at 2% 18 months ago. So if we're doubling every 18 months, we go 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, boom, it's game over within this decade. And we're starting to see those exponentials kick in across all the major sectors. So my biggest desire for COP26 in Glasgow was that the nations of the world and the investors of the world and the CEOs of the world and the citizens of the world all see that transition has become inevitable and decide to get on board, so that by the time we get to 2030, we have halved emissions. We're well on the way to implementing the circular economy and to creating a world which is much better for the generations to come.
Nigel defined COP26 as a key milestone in achieving unstoppable momentum to tackle climate change. During the next weeks, we will hear a lot about the negotiations and discussions taking place, covering a wide array of topics, such as the built environment, mobility, finance, nature, gender, science and innovation, among others. First up, let's hear about a conversation I had with Miranda Schnitger, who leads our work with governments at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, about what COP26 is and the role of the circular economy in tackling climate change. So thank you, Miranda, for being here with me today as part of the Circular Economy Show, where we're going to be discussing COP26 and all the things that are happening around it. So there is, of course, a lot of noise and momentum built around this conference that is taking place over the next 2 weeks. But could you give us an intro to what COP26 is and why does it play such a critical role in tackling climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm delighted to be here. So it's typically an annual meeting at which all the different government delegations come together to align on climate targets and actions. this particular COP is really important in several ways. As you mentioned in your question, there's like more and more clamour about this COP. It feels akin to COP21, which was 6 years ago, but would have been 5 years ago. There's a real focus on this one because at the Paris COP, where they agreed on the 2-degree pathway and the ambition to go to a 1.5-degree pathway, now 5 years on or 6 years on as a result of the pandemic, countries are resubmitting their updated nationally determined contribution plans, which is where they lay out how each country is going to seek to deliver on the targets that are ahead of us. So that makes it really important as a sort of milestone. As sort of already mentioned, it's actually delayed by a year as a result of the pandemic. It's going to be an interesting one because there will be an element of hybridness to this. Obviously, the pandemic has complicated things. But I would also say that partly the pandemic and partly just events, the climate that we have all experienced and are living through, the changes in it, the recent report from the IPCC, AR6, that noted like the severity of the challenge of the climate. There's a real focus on this, and it also combines with a lot of activation and activism that we've seen around the issue of climate change. So yeah, there's a real focus on this one, and yeah, I think everyone's hoping optimistically as we go into this, but we will see more momentum coming out of it. But it is a challenge, all the negotiations and bringing everyone together. But yeah, it's absolutely the key topic of the decade that we need to address in order for our economies and our everything to continue.
I just want us to come back to talk a little bit more about the circular economy. And here at the Foundation, we talk about the circular economy as this bigger idea built on 3 principles driven by design. So eliminate waste and pollution, circulate products and materials at their highest value, and regenerate nature. But what role does the circular economy play in tackling climate change?
Yeah, brilliant question. Very on point, of course, for our work. We did a study in 2019 that looked at where emissions were coming from, and that identified that actually 45% of emissions comes from the way we make and use products and food and how we manage our land. So those emissions, that's when circular economy can play a really important part, because the circular economy is also about how we make and use items. If one thinks about the 3 principles of the circular economy, it's quite a helpful way of seeing how the contribution works. So under eliminate waste and pollution, for example, in a circular economy for fashion, if you design waste and pollution out of the production and manufacturing side of it, you can halve annual emissions from that sector to around 1.1 billion metric tons by 2030. If you think about circulate products and materials, another example is another study has found that if you give second life through remanufacturing to products, that can result in 90% of savings compared to a new product being produced. And that's a really interesting area around the embodied energy that has. When you make a product, of course, energy goes into that. But if you find ways of keeping it in use, then you can reduce the emissions as per that study found. And then the 3rd principle is regenerate nature. Regenerate nature can come from various different elements of the circular economy, but to think specifically about food, if you design food for nature, you can reduce emissions by up to 70%, and biodiversity impacts can be reduced by about 50% compared to the current way of doing things. So you can see there how each of the 3 principles contributes. And of course, in specific examples, you can also have all the different elements of the circular economy working together. So it's a really important part of solving for the 45% of emissions from the way we make and use products.
Coming back to COP26, Miranda, and thinking about the circular economy, how have you seen the concept or this bigger idea of the circular economy evolve in the discussions and in the negotiations that take part at COPs?
Yeah, I think it's a new and growing area. A lot of focus is on the energy side, which is very, that's completely understandable. But this material side, if you want to think about it like that, well, the contribution that can make and changes in how we manage the material side, that's beginning to come through. It's a growing area. There's obviously a lot more to be done because the circular economy is, as you and I know, it's quite a big topic. And so there's a lot more to be done to think about, not just looking at, for example, improving recycling, but as per some of the examples I mentioned earlier, some of the other loops, like how can they integrate circular economy into policy measures that do support remanufacturing, that do support the transition to regenerative agriculture, that do support the design out of waste and pollution through the manufacturing process and the use process.
And I think you've mentioned some of the key elements that we need to see more of. But in order for countries and regions, I mean, we literally have the whole world coming together for this specific conference. What are, like, in a nutshell, like, kind of the major action points you think we need to see in the upcoming years in order for these countries and regions to really leverage the full potential of the circular economy?
Yeah, so thinking about it in policy terms, we recently did a piece of work around common policy goals for a circular economy, and I think we're starting to see more of the policies around resource management. What will be really exciting is to see more policies that support the upstream innovation side. For example, to think of a few policies that the EU is currently looking at, Sustainable Products Initiative. That's a new area of policy that could potentially really change the incentives and the signals that are sent to the market about thinking through actually the principles of the circular economy in terms of what is put on the market. Mm-hmm. So that's on the policy side. I think we can see a lot more of that, a lot more of connecting the circular economy to a lot of different agendas. Another thing that I think we need to see is actually a lot of practical demonstrations becoming, seeing it in action. It can look and take many different forms, and it doesn't necessarily always carry a label, but everything from tool libraries that you might be aware of in your local city to when you go to a shop, you may start seeing more reuse functions to actually accessing products more as a service, potentially with a provider, where the maintenance of an item can be longer than, for example, if you own it yourself. So the practical side needs to continue and needs to grow, and that's something that is a key function, a key role for business to play. And then on the policy side, as I was saying, we need to see. It's great that the concept is being talked about. It's great that it's connected to certain areas, but actually to scale it, it needs to connect into other areas. We need to think about how we really make the economics work and what economic incentives are on the market, because we have had a linear economy for a very long time. So all of the incentives within our current economy are very in line with a linear economy, unsurprisingly, because that's what we currently have. So there's quite a bit to do to scale it.
Yeah, I hope that, in a year's time, we're talking again, Miranda, and that we can see a lot more of these things happening and taking place. Thank you so much for being here with me today in the Circular Economy Show.
Thank you, Laura.
So, while 50% of our global greenhouse gas emissions could be tackled by shifting to renewable energies or improving energy efficiency, the remaining 45% of the global emissions come from the way we make and use our products, and also the way we grow our food and use our land. And the circular economy is critical in addressing these emissions, hence helping us tackle climate change. There will be a lot of actors involved in these negotiations, with governments or the parties playing a crucial role. Let's talk to one of the countries who has just returned to the Paris Agreement and, due to its size and economic power, plays a key role in tackling climate change. Here is a snippet of the conversation that my colleague Carmen Valache Altinel had with Andrew Griffin, who works for the US Department of State.
Welcome to the Circular Economy Show, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to start our conversation with a question that is probably on everybody's mind because COP26 is starting this Sunday. What are your expectations from this important climate conference?
Yeah, thank you so much, Carmen. Thanks for having me on the show. This is the start of a pivotal event. And I think put simply, what the United States expects is that the world is going to come together in Glasgow and we're going to meet this moment. And it is, as I mentioned, it's a pivotal moment. It's a crucial moment where as a world, we have to decide that we are going to take action in this decisive decade to tackle the climate crisis. And so what we're hoping to see, what we're hoping to leave Glasgow with is a shared commitment that will put the world significantly more on track to keep within reach the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
That's good to hear. And Andrew, you are on the US delegation to Glasgow. You're part of the leadership of that delegation. What are the priorities for the delegation in Glasgow and how will those contribute to the world's ability to stay on a 1.5 degree pathway?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's fair to say that this is going to be an action-packed 2 weeks in Glasgow. We have a lot of work to do, but one of our main priorities in Glasgow is going to be to work with all countries, work with basically all parties to the Paris Agreement to send the strongest possible signal of our commitment to collective action to tackle the climate crisis. Both the commitment that we will make in Glasgow and then post-Glasgow, because we have to continue to step up our ambition and to take concrete action if we're going to be able to make progress in tackling the crisis in this decade. And so that's one of our major priorities. A second key priority for Glasgow is that there's an important work that's left to do on the Paris Agreement rulebook. And so there are key outstanding issues that our negotiators will be working on very closely with other countries, with the goal really of making sure that the implementation of the Paris Agreement is effective and that it produces the results. And so what you'll see in Glasgow is you'll have a whole of government approach. You'll see not the President of the United States, but senior officials, senior cabinet officials presenting key areas of our government. And again, all conveying that the United States is going to lead in tackling the climate crisis and that we're going to do our part. And we intend to lead by example. And so we will have a number of key initiatives that will be announced in the next 2 weeks. One of the key initiatives that does involve very close collaboration with the private sector is the First Movers Coalition. And this was launched actually at the end of September, but the First Movers Coalition seeks to engage key companies across the globe that want to move first and to reduce emissions and take concrete actions to reduce emissions in their supply chains. And so we hope that at Glasgow we can really highlight this initiative as a key example of how governments and private sector can work together. We're also really excited that at Glasgow, we will be formally launching the Global Methane Pledge, which is a key effort that the United States and the European Union have co-led to bring countries together around a shared goal of reducing methane emissions by 30%. This is a global goal of reducing emissions 30% by 2030.
Thank you for clarifying that point, Andrew. My next question has to do with a phrase that we've heard President Biden and Secretary Blinken use quite frequently since the beginning of the year, which is American leadership on climate change. Can you explain, please, what will this leadership look like in the coming months and years?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. And so, yes, the United States does intend to lead on climate. That was something that President Biden made very clear on day one when he announced that we'd be rejoining the Paris Agreement. On day 7, when he signed a series of executive orders on January 27th that instructed a whole of government approach to tackling the climate crisis and instructed the United States, basically the US government, to exercise our leadership to enhance global ambition. And so I think that what you're going to see is that climate change is going to be at the center of U.S. foreign policy, of U.S. diplomacy, U.S. national security. And that means that in terms of how we lead, we're going to be ambitious. We're going to make sure that we don't take our eye off of the critical need to act quickly. This is an urgent crisis and we need to act quickly. And so working together with all countries, including the United States, all countries to scale up our ambition, to take concrete action. These are going to be key features of US leadership. But we're also going to lead collaboratively. We really do believe that every country has a role to play in tackling the climate crisis. That includes all countries working to reduce emissions and to bring down global emissions so that we can stay on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, to hit net zero global emissions by 2050. But that also means working together very closely to think through and support each other on ways to enhance resilience to climate, because the climate crisis is real. And climate impacts are already affecting vulnerable communities across the world. And so that's going to be a key element where we're going to see greater cooperation, greater collaboration. And that's been a key feature of our approach the last 10 months. So the collaboration is going to be a second key feature. But I want to just say that the last key element of US leadership is that we are going to approach all of this work with humility. We understand, we know that during the prior administration, we abdicated our leadership on climate, and that there's a lot of ground to make up. And that in order to make that ground up, we are going to have to, again, work together, listen to each other, and really commit to collaboration and cooperation in order to achieve our shared climate goals.
We look forward to seeing a lot of that, Andrew. My last question has to do with how the circular economy and climate change come together really in U.S. domestic policy. And I was hoping we could spend a few minutes delving into different examples. So the nationally determined contribution, or NDC, that you mentioned earlier in our conversation, that the United States published in April was a landmark in many ways. It was the country's first climate change strategy under the Paris Agreement. It was eagerly awaited by many. It also set out some sector-by-sector pathways that the government will prioritize in its decarbonization efforts, including electricity, including transport, industry, buildings, as well as agriculture and land use. And aside from these pathways, it also identified non-CO2 emissions, right? So methane, nitrous oxide, and those other potent heat-trapping gases as a priority for the government, right? So we know what the climate change or climate action priorities are for the U.S. government. How do you think that the circular economy can contribute to them? And do you think that the circular economy can contribute to these important priorities?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, the reality is that circularity is going to be a key element of our entire sort of domestic climate agenda and our approach on reducing emissions and advancing kind of implementation of our nationally determined contribution. So, you highlighted several examples, but I think many of the elements of the U.S. nationally determined contribution can be considered circular. Just to highlight, for example, you asked about the transport sector, and that's a key area where we're going to be looking at ways to promote, low carbon transport, urban redesign that will, again, allow for us to reduce emissions significantly in the transportation sector. And circularity will be a key conceptual approach to that challenge, but it's also going to be a key aspect of how we approach hard to abate sectors, right? So how do we use some of the principles of circular economy and some of the what we've learned about material choice in order to reduce emissions in key sectors like steel, like aluminum, like the chemical sector. And so that's another area where circularity is going to be critical to our approach on the NDC.
Hi, this episode of the Circular Economy Show is part of our network workshop, an event that takes place twice a year and that's designed for and with the Foundation's network. These workshops provide a forum for circular economy insights and inspiration and enable network organizations to connect, learn, and collaborate with other circular economy professionals around the world. It's currently taking place online, so if your organization is part of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's network, you can register now at community.emf.org. Thank you, and back to the studio.
Despite the regional groups, national delegations have organized themselves in groups that better reflect their interests for the negotiations coming up at COP26. Among these groups, we have the group of the least developed countries, we have the EU 27 national bloc, the Arab states, or the G77 group of developing economies. My colleague Seb had the opportunity to talk to Quamrul Chowdhury, who is the lead negotiator of the G77 group, about what this group is, what are some of the challenges that they are facing coming up to the event, and what the world needs to do in order to meet the Paris Agreement goals.
Welcome to the Circular Economy Show. For audience members who don't know, I wondered if you could just tell us, what is the G77 and what are its goals?
Yeah, it is like, say, representatives, diplomats, negotiators of all the developing countries, all the southern countries, say, small island developing states, least developed countries, Gulak, African countries. So these are the countries comprising G77, and later on China joined, so G77 plus China. But now it is 135 countries.
So G77 is 135 countries, and obviously the event that we're looking forward to here, the COP26 in Glasgow, is a significant, I'm sure it's taking up a lot of your time and a lot of the headspace of other members of that group. What are the kind of most significant bottlenecks or challenges that the G77 faces as you work your way into COP26?
So, as you know, G77 and China is the largest group of countries. Almost all the developing countries, almost all the southern countries, almost all the each and every least developed countries, and also climate vulnerable countries are within G77 and China, right now coordinated by Guinea. So that landmark Paris Agreement, if we want to keep alive 1.5 degree temperature rise goal, global goal alive, then this is the last train, and we must cut back our collective emissions of all the countries, emissions of the G20 countries, the richest countries, the industrialized countries, Annex 1 countries. They must cut back their emission steeply before 2030 so that the global temperature rise can be kept within 1.5 degree rise. So this is a huge challenge. But as you know that the collective NDCs, all the NDCs submitted so far to the United Nations Framework Convention Secretariat doesn't say give us a signal that it can contain within 1.5 degree centigrade temperature rise. It can go beyond that. It can go 3 degrees, even plus. So we must cut back. That is the call given by very loud and clear by the IPCC AR6 assessment report in its summary for the policymakers. We need to scale up climate finance, ramp up climate finance, not only $100 billion from 2020 every year, but it requires trillions of dollars from now up till 2030. And that long-term climate finance should be pumped in immediately, and that should be agreed upon in Glasgow COP26 if we want to keep 1.5 degree temperature rise alive. And then also we need to scale up adaptation goal, adaptation ambitions significantly, because we have emitted so much carbon dioxide so far that requires a lot of adaptation right now, right across the continents, across the developing countries, across the most vulnerable climate adverse impacted countries. More than 4 billion people are now on the hook of climate change, adverse impacts of climate change, hurricanes, tornadoes, cyclones, inundation, flooding, droughts, desertification, and also forest fires everywhere in every continent. And those are the key challenges we are now facing.
You mentioned NDCs, nationally determined contributions. You mentioned the IPCC report, which was quite the latest one, which was quite stark in terms of both its a kind of outlook in terms of how things currently play out, and also the scale up of ambition that's really required from around the world, from policymakers and business. You're the representative, and you are at G77. Is many of the countries in the G77 are some of the worst affected by the impacts and the effects of climate change, as you were kind of describing as well. How important is this, that there's an economic solution to this?
Now we have to take those kind of hard decisions, fiscal decisions, policy decisions, economic decisions, investment decisions, and also consumption and production decisions. Our consumption pattern has to be changed, and luxurious lifestyles of the richest countries, most industrialized countries, have to change immediately, forthright, because they are emitting so much because of their luxurious production system, consumption system, behavioral pattern, cultural, mantras have to be changed, shifted, geared towards sustainable development, towards climate smart development. And that is what G77 countries are also pursuing, because we are not responsible at all. Least developed countries are not responsible at all. Small island developing states are not at all responsible for, at least historical responsibilities are not with them, G77 and countries. But we are the victims, innocent victims. Therefore, we are also taking a lot of actions, climate actions, so that climate adaptation can be promoted in our countries. Climate mitigation are also we pursuing, but at the same time, we asked those who are historically responsible for this manage, those who are root cause of climatic changes, root cause of emitting carbon emissions in the atmosphere, they should lead from the front.
It is clear that COP26 represents a key milestone in addressing climate change, and that people worldwide are expecting over the forthcoming weeks to see more ambitions, more commitments, and more action being mobilized towards achieving the Paris Agreement goals. This is it for this episode of the Circular Economy Show. Subscribe to or follow us on the channel where you're watching this video if you want to be notified every time we go live. If you've missed some of our episodes, or if you would like to know more about what we have coming up in the next 2 weeks, please check our website. Thank you so much, and see you soon in the Circular Economy Show.